I do want to make sure to thank our wonderful friends of the library organization for their generous support for today's program. And just in case you are not familiar with Dr. Ron Brown, here's a little background. After decades spent traveling the world and picking up university degrees from Jerusalem, Harvard, and Geneva, Dr. Ron Brown settled in New York City in 1992. He's been teaching history, ethnic studies, and political science at Touro College and world religions at the Unification Theological Seminary for over 25 years. He has been deeply involved in the cultural life of New York City through his work as a featured speaker at the New York Historical Society, New York Council for the Humanities, and numerous other libraries, historical societies, colleges, and universities. And we're welcoming back Ron Brown today to take us around the world to Bombay. So take it away, Ron.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff. And thank you, everybody out there at Port Washington Library who have been so successful in keeping these programs going during these dark days of pandemic. Well, I just got back from Paris. I spend my month of August every year in Paris, which I didn't do last year when I was unable to leave New York. So it was really great to get back to Paris and to once again be able to travel. Well, I'll tell you, when I was in Paris for the month of August, it was in the midst of the fourth wave of the pandemic, which meant I was unable to go to museums. I was unable to take long distance trains. All of the hotels and major restaurants wouldn't let me in. I couldn't even get into McDonald's. Not that I really tried that hard, but it was really an adventure. But of course, most of you know me already that like a friend of mine once said, that when I die and go to hell, I'll probably be relatively well adjusted after a couple of weeks and be doing PowerPoints and sending them to the Port Washington Library on all the wonderful people I've been meeting and experiences I've been having in hell. So, you know, stay tuned. We'll schedule them, or hopefully we won't schedule them shortly, but you never know. So, well, then I endured the fourth wave of pandemic in Paris. Well, then lo and behold, I flew into the library, right? I flew into the airport at Newark because you had a terrible rainstorm the Wednesday night before I arrived. Well, I managed to get to the airport okay, and then I managed to take the bus to the city, the Port Authority, but then all the subways in Queens were flooded. So those of you who know New York all know that you can also take the 7 train, which is high above the floodwaters. So I got to Jackson Heights and then I was able to walk the rest of the way to my place. Well, I ended up, my most important place in Queens was my liquor store. So as I hold up my glass of red wine, and I found out that the basement of my liquor store had been completely flooded out, as were a lot of the basement apartments here in Queens. Now I live on the 2nd floor, and so we didn't have any damage. I live on a hill overlooking JCPenney's just off of Queens Boulevard. So, you know, so I managed to get back okay. But once again, these are wonderful experiences. Well, for some, they're wonderful. For some, they are difficult. So I collected information, took thousands of photographs in France on how the French were responding to COVID-19, which is very difficult, very different from the American or the Mexican, where I spent spring break last year doing research as well. So it's great to be back, and I'm glad everybody out at the library is in good shape, and we are back on target for the continuation of this series on the great cities of the world. Today we're doing Mumbai, which a lot of you still remember as Bombay. And just an update, in October, on October 8th, I'll be talking about my year spent teaching in Moscow. When I got to Moscow, my passport, my visa said, welcome to the USSR. And when I left a year later, it said, thank you for visiting the Russian Republic. So that was the time I was there. And then in November 19th, we have New Orleans, the city of voodoo, as well as the city, once again in the news, of hurricanes and floods and everything else. And then December 17, we're going to be doing Petra, the crossroads between Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, which was very important in the evolution of modern rabbinical Judaism, the evolution of Christianity, and the roots of Islam in this magnificent carved city in the mountains. So, well, today we are on Mumbai. Now, just a reminder again, as Jeff said, please feel free to use the chat function. Okay, I will speak for about 45 minutes and then I will take anybody who has typed anything in the chat. And at the very end, you can unmute yourself and you can give conversations, or if any of you have visited the wonderful city of Bombay, you can share your experiences. So once again, Bombay is called, and its nickname is the gateway to empire. Just like every other city, New York is the empire city. Paris is the city of lights. Moscow is the third Rome. Jerusalem is the city of gold. Every city has a personality that evolves over time. Some of them, like Jerusalem, going way back into thousands of years ago. Others, like Moscow, more recent, and Bombay, even more recent. But yet, each city develops a personality, a unique characteristic that really exemplifies the city. So we'll begin with the wonderful world of empires. Why is Bombay called the gateway to empire? Then we'll talk about the founding of Bombay by the Portuguese, the East India takeover, turning it into a capital of another empire, how it became the gateway to modern India, and then Mumbai today. So let's begin our visit. Now, this is the most striking feature of Bombay. It was built by the British, and it was called by the British the gateway to their empire. It is on the Indian Ocean, right on the ocean. You can see the ships in front of it giving tours. And it was the gate through which the English troops marched as they conquered the Empire of India and turned it into a British colony. India was so important in the British Empire that Queen Victoria, who we see on the right, was Her Most Gracious Majesty Queen Victoria, Empress of India. Now, this was very important because in the late 1800s, there weren't all that many emperors on throne. You had the Emperor of China, you had the Emperor of Japan, you had the Emperor of Ethiopia, and you had the Emperor of Russia. You also had the Kaiser of Germany and the Kaiser of the Austrian Empire. So when Queen Victoria was given the title Empress of India, she joined the ranks of the emperors of the world. Now, Trivial Pursuit question today, how many emperors do we still have in the world today? The only one who has survived all these centuries is the Emperor of Japan, the last surviving emperor. So Mumbai was very important as far as the building of the empire. Now, empire is very much in the news today. When I was in France, everybody was talking about the decline and fall of the American empire. You see the book on the right, Le Chute de l'Empire Américain, which is not just a book, but it is also a film. Is the American empire entering its last days? The book's on China. Is China the rising empire? So when I was in China and I was sitting and having coffee underneath the gateway to empire, I seriously thought, how do empires come into being? Who creates empires? They rise, they flourish, and as many people argue, the American empire is declining. The British Empire declined. Is the USA an empire? Is the USA a declining empire? Is China the empire of the future? So sitting under that monumental, overpowering gateway to empire, once again, I just couldn't have fun and enjoy my vacation. I had to be doing something serious. So I linked the Empire of India with the Babylonian Empire, the Arab Empire, the Empire of Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire from Britain to Iraq, the Inca and the Aztec empires, and the British Empire. What causes empires to rise, to flourish, and decline? On the left, you see the famous book, Edward Gibbon's, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Volume 1 was published in the year 1776, the very year that the United States established itself, declared its independence. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin were all carrying around their volume 1 of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. So the rise and fall of empires is something which has preoccupied Americans for a very long time. Hundreds of books written on the decline of the British Empire, the decline of the Empire of Solomon, the first Jewish empire which stretched from the Euphrates almost to the Nile, what caused the great empire of Solomon to decline. The rise of China and the decline of China with the Opium Wars. So what we're going to discover in Mumbai is a serious consideration of empires, rising, falling, asking serious questions. Is the American empire on a decline? Rocky Mirza, The Rise and Fall of the American Empire, Midnight for the American Empire, The Rise and Decline of the American Empire. So this is what I was doing on my crazy vacation. Well, we're not only talking about an Indian empire, but Donald Trump was going to make America great again. Confront Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, confront China, confront the rise of India, confront the new challenges to the great empire of the present. It was Samuel P. Huntington who came up with the phrase, the clash of civilizations, where he talks about the United States as the herald of Western civilization, confronting the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Russia, and the rise of the Muslim world. Are we entering again a new age of a clash of empires, the clash of civilizations? On the right, you see my book, How New York Became the Empire City. How did a city, Dutch colony, New Amsterdam, rise, become mythically known as the Empire City? Who called New York the Empire City for the very first time? None other than George Washington. And a few years later, Thomas Cole, the greatest painter of New York early history, painted his vision of the future Empire City. That you see on the right, 1836. This hangs in the New York Historical Society. Hudson River cutting through the picture, the Atlantic Ocean in the distance. Now you might say, it doesn't look like much of New York City today, but don't forget in 1836, Greek architecture was the rage of the United States. Washington, D.C. is built on Greek and Roman architecture. Greek-looking temples, men in togas. This was the source of the Empire City of America. So today we are going to visit Mumbai. If you look at the map on the left, you can see Mumbai on the left-hand side, on the western side of India, where you see Bombay, facing the Arabian Sea, Oman, Somalia, Africa, the Middle East. So it was the ideal location for the British to enter India and begin to conquer the great Mughal Empire that included at the time Pakistan, India, Nepal, Burma, and Bangladesh, one of the largest and most heavily populated empires in the world when India started taking over. Now, I spent a wonderful vacation of January when I visited Bombay. I had previously been to India, but I had visited the north, up where you see New Delhi, going the whole way down to Patna along the Ganges. But in 2018, in my usual Toro College winter vacation, I decided to visit Bombay and this coast. I flew to Goa, which is a beautiful Portuguese city south of Bombay. I went north to Pune, which you see beside Bombay. Pune is the pharmaceutical capital of India. In fact, half of all of the COVID-19 vaccinations which are given around the world are actually produced in Pune by subsidiaries of Moderna and the other ones. Then I went up to Mumbai towards the end of January. So on my way over, I flew from New York to the wonderful cities of Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and then from Dubai, I flew over to Bombay. So there you see a couple pictures of me at the top of the world in the Great Khalifa Tower, tallest building in the world, overlooking the Persian Gulf. So that's how I ended up getting to Mumbai. The history of Bombay. Well, when the Europeans started exploring the world, they basically found empty continents. When people like Vasco da Gama sailed around the coast of South Africa and discovered that you could sail around South Africa and up and enter the Indian Ocean. And he went to Calcutta and to Goa. At that time, there was no Bombay. It did not exist. In fact, it was the Portuguese who established the city. If anybody speaks Portuguese, you'll see that the name Bombay simply means a good bay. So basically, to translate Bombay into modern English, you say a damn good place to have a big harbor. Well, of course, nothing was there when they got there, because the great empires of the Mughals and of the Indians, like the great empires of the Africans, were all inside the country. They didn't go to the coast. I remember when I traveled in Senegal and in Cameroon, in Africa, when I would suggest to my friends to go to the beach, oh, the Africans trembled. They were fearful of the ocean. They were not ocean people. They were jungle people. And the same thing with the Indians. So when Vasco da Gama started exploring India, he established coastal cities. Calcutta was established by the Portuguese. Goa was established by the Portuguese. Mumbai was established by the Portuguese for the export of silk, muslin, printed multicolored cloth called chintz, tea, gems, onyx, rice, cotton, and tobacco, which were all produced on the interior. So when Vasco da Gama and the other Portuguese started exploring Africa as well as India, they had to build coastal towns where they would bring the rice, the cotton, the silk, and everything else from the interior. They would bring it to the coast where they would put it in great warehouses. And then every once in a while, the flotilla of ships from Portugal and later England would arrive, load up the ships with all these products, pay for them with glass beads, glass cups and other things, as well as guns and iron swords and everything. And they would ship everything back to Portugal or Spain or France or later England. So that's how Bombay or Bombay came into existence. It was a European creation, which is why it is called by England the gateway to India. You march in to take over through the gateway. Well, the Portuguese East India Company was the private company that established Bombay. It was not established by the government. The government chartered the Portuguese East India Company to explore, build ports and harbors on the coast, and begin a lively trade. The Portuguese would stop off in Africa, fill up the ship with a bunch of African slaves, take them over to Mumbai, Goa, Calcutta. They got gold and silver from India. They got spices, silk, rubber, porcelain, gems, and they would ship it back to Portugal. So these are called stock companies. So that if you were a Portuguese person and you had some extra money, you would invest in a ship that was leaving tomorrow to go to Calcutta or to Bombay in exchange for slaves and iron objects and glass. You would load up your ship with silk and rubber and porcelain and whatever, bring it back to Portugal, and you had your fingers crossed and you hoped you would make a fortune. Now, this was not just Portuguese. Approximately in 1792, New York established its New York Stock Exchange to do exactly the same thing. New York Stock Exchange in 1792 made a fortune importing slaves from Africa, selling them all over the South, making a fortune, and investing it in even more ships to bring over the slaves. Here we see the founding of the stock market in 1792. But if you look down Wall Street in the other direction, at the very end was the New York City slave market, where thousands of slaves were bought and sold. So every major country in the West had its stock market. Portugal, Spain, Holland, one of the biggest, London, even bigger, New York had their markets where they would invest in such explorations and hopefully make a fortune. The Dutch had their empire. New Amsterdam was part of it. Other countries established their empires as well. The Dutch took over Indonesia. They took over South Africa. They took over a big chunk of Portugal. Australia was originally called New Holland because it was taken over by the Dutch. So the Dutch had a great empire, and New York was part of this great empire. Well, the Portuguese were doing the same thing. Little tiny Portugal on the coast took over what is today Brazil, had settlements all along the coast of Africa, both east and west, and went up establishing colonies. Mumbai or Bombay was established barely had Christopher Columbus crossed the ocean. Then the Portuguese established Bombay in 1509. And you see all of the Portuguese trading colonies in the early 1400s. In fact, the last of its colonies, Brazil, was established in 1500 and it got its independence in the 1800s. Portugal kept control of Mozambique until the 1900s. So this was the founding of Bombay as a trading post, bringing the wealth of the Indian interior, selling it to Portuguese traders, and then taking the wealth of India back to Portugal. So it was clearly a great harbor for exploiting the riches of the declining Mughal Empire in India. Now, when you visit Bombay, you still see the vestiges of the Dutch colony. You look at the map in the middle, you see the yellow part. That was the peninsula that the Portuguese took over. They built a wall, you see the red line there, to protect the city from the Indians who would think taking it over. Now, this was very similar to the Wall Street in New York. The Dutch built a wall to protect their trading post of New Amsterdam from the Indians of the interior. So the Portuguese did the same thing in 1509. And you can still see some of these magnificent fortifications built of giant stones, these walls which could repel an invasion, could withstand cannon shots. And there's me standing during my trip to Mumbai, and I was absolutely thrilled with these fortifications, which literally funneled billions of dollars of spices, of gold, of silver, of silk, of porcelain back to Portugal. And it witnessed the import of millions of African slaves among the Indian ruling elite in both India and China. It was very stylish to have an honor guard, a bodyguards of 6 feet tall Black African slaves. So slavery was a very important product for Mumbai, just as it was for New Amsterdam. And so it was clearly the gateway to empire. Now, when you go to Mumbai today, the city is the oldest part. It has the old Portuguese remains, as well as the remains built by the English. And at the very, very bottom of that tongue that's hanging down, that is where the great archway is, the gateway to India. Well, of course, today, the city has expanded into one of the largest cities on the face of the earth. You see the Bombay suburban district. Across the bay, you see New Bombay, and it is constantly expanding to the north, but the city retains its beautiful historical character. Well, it was the Dutch who built it, and they ruled it from 1509 to 1661. Well, 1660s was a crucial year for the decline of the Portuguese Empire and the rise of the British Empire. In 1661, the British fleet sailed in and conquered Mumbai and turned it into Bombay, the British colony. 3 years later, the same British fleet sailed into New York Harbor, overthrew Governor Stuyvesant, and renamed their colony from New Amsterdam to New York. So this marked, both in India and in North America, the decline of the Dutch and Portuguese empires and the rise of the East India Company, which gradually replaced the Dutch Empire as well as the Portuguese, and even took over large areas of the Spanish Empire. 1664, we see Governor Stuyvesant surrendering his colony to the British. Just a couple years later, or a couple years earlier, the English took Bombay. Same time, they took French Quebec, they took Singapore, they took Hong Kong, they took Australia, they took large parts of Africa and South America. So Bombay received a new name, but as the gateway to India, it remained a very important city. The map at the bottom, in the middle, you see what they call the British India Empire, which gradually included all of Pakistan, all of India, all of Nepal, Bangladesh, and Burma. So when Queen Victoria was crowned Empress of India, it wasn't just India, but it was this giant empire, the largest empire on the face of the earth and the most populous empire. Well, the English conquered Mumbai, and in 1665, they started building the British fort, which you can still see today when you go to Mumbai. Started out as a rather modest structure, but you always, the top picture, you see it from the interior, where the Indians brought all of their riches to sell to the English. And the bottom picture shows the English fort as viewed from the ocean, with the ships sailing in to take the treasures of India back to Great Britain. On the right, you see the eventual red fort made of bricks and fortified, because the English were also competing with the Russians, they were competing with the Chinese, and the French were always looking over the shoulder to see what they too could grab of the once great Portuguese Empire. So this is what we call the scramble for colonies. Grab everything you can. Russia was expanding across the Siberia. France was taking over the Mississippi Valley, half of Africa, Vietnam. Holland was clinging to its colonies in Brazil and South America, South Africa, and Indonesia. Even the United States was expanding to the Pacific Ocean and then taking over Hawaii, Midway, and eventually the Philippines. This was the age of empire, and India was part of the British Empire. People went to India mainly to get rich. The third son always had no future in Britain. Son number one inherited the father's wealth. Son number two maybe could go to university and become a doctor or a lawyer. But son number three had no future. Son number three would go off to the colonies, become a big man, steal everything he could get his hands on, and return to England even richer, if he was lucky, than son number one and number two. Now, when the British took over India, the question was, and heavily debated now, were the great empires good or bad for history? Well, the British said the white man's burden is to bring healthcare, education, modernization, civilization, even spiritual salvation to these poor backward people. So the British Empire, like the American, French, Russian, Spanish, Portuguese empires, really believed in what they were doing. So when the British was grabbing the empire, and of course, India was the crown jewel. They even tried to take over Afghanistan, surging through the gateway to India. And of course, we all know the story. Even the British were stopped by the Afghanis, just like the American empire was humbled last week by the rise of the Taliban and the exodus of the American troops. May 1st, 1876, Queen Victoria was declared the Empress of India. Now, of course, she didn't go to India, but she proudly surrounded herself with a bodyguard of Indian mercenaries who were the ones charged with protecting their empress. So Bombay remained the main entranceway. And in fact, it was very popular under Queen Victoria's time to have great military parades around the arch, which was re-erected not that long ago in 1911 to 1924 by King George V. And you see the picture on the right, one flag, one empire, one king, one fleet. India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all of the great elements of the powerful British Empire. And on the left, you see rows of soldiers lined up for a big event, and you can see the ships in the distance. The great archway became a really magnificent stage for the celebration of empire. Now, when the British got to Mumbai and along the coast of Goa, they discovered that there was a very rich Christian and Jewish culture already in Mumbai and in Goa and Calcutta. It is believed that St. Thomas in the very first century left Palestine. Peter went to Rome. James became the Bishop of Jerusalem, but St. Thomas went to India. And he converted large numbers of the Indians, which today have churches all over Mumbai and Goa and the Indian coast. And they are called the Malankara Orthodox Syrian, and another branch is the Jacobite Syrian churches. And they are an independent Orthodox church, not under the Russian Orthodox or not under the Catholics or the Protestants, a very rich Christian tradition along the coast. And until today, you don't expect it, but you see that Mumbai became a center for Christian and Jewish populations. Here we see Mount Mary Catholic Church, built in 1760 in the Gothic architecture. Many of the indigenous Indian Christians converted to Catholicism or to the Anglican Church of England, and the British built churches all over the place in their typical Gothic, but sort of an orientalized style of architecture. That's one of the wonderful things about Mumbai, is that it is really a cosmopolitan city and has always been, since it was an artificial city built first by the Portuguese Catholics and taken over by the Anglicans, the British, but yet attracting this myriad population from all over the world because it was a trading city. It was a business city, very much like New York, attracting anybody and everybody interested in getting rich. This is the British-built train station, probably one of the most eccentric and exotic railroad stations on the face of the earth. This was built in 1878. Train stations in Mumbai and everywhere else in the British Empire were a sign of the justification of the British Empire. We are not just exploiting you and conquering you. We are bringing you the benefits of modern civilization. And the railroad, and especially railroad stations, were a sign of all of the benefits that the British Empire was bringing. Look at those magnificent decorations. In fact, they don't really know how to describe this type of architecture. The one which I found somewhat appropriate is the Indo-Saracenic. Saracenic means the Arabs of Iran and Iraq, but with elements of India. So every square inch is decorated, but when you get inside, it looks almost Gothic, with the pointed arches, the tiled ceilings. I mean, it is really like Penn Station was in New York, a marvel of architecture. So the British really emphasized magnificent architecture to show that they were bringing something to India, not just exploiting it. Even the Hindu temples of Mumbai are breathtaking. This is the Bhagavan Hindu temple in its 1780 and 1790 golden age. This is considered the golden age of English India up until 1947, when India became independent. Elaborate. Mumbai was a city of money, and so everything you did had to be overdone. Opulent. I mean, think Donald Trump with his apartment on Fifth Avenue. I mean, almost gaudy, but yet that is what wealth breeds. Magnificent, glorious architecture. The Municipal Corporation building of Mumbai, 1893. Once again, just a breathtaking, heavy Victorian, but yet Indian, Middle Eastern, Asian architecture. This is called the Municipal Corporation. This is not the city hall, but the headquarters of all of the city offices, electric, gas, transportation, railroads, buses, and everything else that the government of the city has to provide. The inside is as elaborate as the outside. Once again, you see the Gothic arches, the elaborate decorations on the top floor around the arches, typical Arab Saracen design, beautifully gold-covered inlays, stained glass windows. I mean, and this is all in the city, the lower part of the peninsula, where you can walk around for hours, and every building is even more thrilling than any other. Many Jews were attracted to this growing opulent business city. In fact, it still has a very large Jewish population. You see the Knesset Eliyahu, 1884, and the Synagogue Magen David of 1864. Once again, elaborate in architecture. Now, like the Ethiopian Jews and the Jews, the Bukharian Jews of Central Asia, the Jews of India were largely not in contact with the Orthodox Judaism of Russia. This is the official state religion of Israel, is Orthodox Judaism. Well, the Jews of India, like the Jews of Ethiopia and Central Asia, never accepted this. The Jews of India, like the Ethiopians, have their own version of the Bible. The Jews of India traditionally did not have rabbis and Torahs and all that. They continued to sacrifice animals in their temples. Now, by the 1800s, Jewish missionaries from the West had forced the Indians to stop sacrificing animals, introduced rabbis and rabbinical Judaism. The Jews of Ethiopia resisted until they were taken to Israel, and the Israeli government forced them to abandon their monasteries, to abandon their priests, to abandon their temples, and to start worshiping in the Eastern European Orthodox style. And so the Jews of India have their own traditions. They've developed their own language, which is a mixture of Hebrew, Gujarat, and other Indian languages, just as the Jews of Eastern Europe blended Hebrew, German, created Yiddish. The Jews of Spain blended Spanish, Arabic, and Hebrew and created Ladino. The Jews of Ethiopia blended Amharic with Hebrew, created their own sacred language. So the traditional Jews of India have tried very hard to preserve their ancient cultures, languages, traditions, and rituals. But you can see from the bright colors, typical Bombay, it is a city of colors and dramatic architecture. The Jews of India are called the Kochin Jews, and it is believed that with the destruction of Solomon's temple and the demise of David's empire, the Jews spread around the world. Some went to Ethiopia, where they became Flourish, and continued building temples and sacrificing animals. The Bukharian Jews of Central Asia developed their own culture with no contact with the Jews of the West. The Jews of China largely disappeared except for certain inscriptions. The Kochin Jews of Southern and of Western India also became indigenized. The Bnei Israel, the unique Bombay Jewish community, like the Jews of Ethiopia and Asia and China, they intermarried with the local people. So the traditional Jews of Bombay look completely Indian. And the only thing that distinguishes them from their Indian brothers and sisters are their religious practices. Like the Ethiopian Jews intermarried with Africans and became predominantly Black, but managed to preserve a lot of their religion and culture. Just walking around Bombay, you just get exhausted taking pictures. I mean, this is a city which radiated wealth. It was the gateway to India, the linchpin between the massive Indian Empire of South Asia and the equally massive British Empire of Britain and Africa. So it was really a centerpiece where the parts of the great the British Empire came together. Just walking down a street in the city, the lower part of the peninsula, every building was just mind-blowing. And luckily, India is preserving these, either accidentally because they don't have the money to tear them down, or because, and to a certain extent more and more, they have a sense of history, that this is a very important part of the Mumbai culture. Another building that blows your mind is right beside the gateway is the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel of 1903, approaching the World War I period, a massive hotel. Luckily, being an American or being a Westerner, you can walk into these places and you can even sit in the courtyard and have tea. Whereas if you were an Indian, they would be security to keep you out. But they figure if you're an American, even me, walking around in my raggedy clothes with a backpack, they would let me come in and I'd wander around. And I always go to the big hotels because they always have a wall with free computers. And so I can go in and check my email and everything and don't have to go to a computer cafe and pay. But this is another one of those absolutely magnificent hotels. But there's a lot of lower class, popular neighborhoods where the buildings are built of wood. As you can see, the top two, fewer and fewer of them are left. Most of them burned down or are torn down, but these were not frequented by the British and the Western elite. They were for the emerging Indian middle class. Below that, you see another building with shutters on it, but that one is made of stone or cement and plaster. But yet you still don't see air conditioners in a lot of these old buildings. But they themselves are rapidly disappearing, being replaced by more elegant buildings. Well, the British left on February 28, 1948. India, because of Mahatma Gandhi's peaceful resistance, decided that it was better to just abandon this giant colony. Of course, the Indian Empire was broken up. Pakistan and its sister republic of Bangladesh became predominantly Muslim. Burma was declared a Buddhist kingdom. Sri Lanka became Buddhist, and it resulted in a horrendous exchange of population, where millions of Muslims fled India. Many were slaughtered. Hindus fled Pakistan and Bangladesh and Burma, and it was a period of bloodthirst. And you see the times of India, birth of India's freedom, frenzied enthusiasm in Bombay, crowds in festive mood. Well, why was Bombay so important? Well, once again, when the last British troops left India, they marched through the archway of the Gate of India. So it was a gate both admitting people and a gate which witnessed the farewell of the British, which is again why the great gateway to India is so important. The arrival of the British Empire, the departure of the British Empire. Now, of course, I don't stay in the big, super expensive hotels. Problem in traveling in India is, as you well know, the cow is a sacred animal. Well, as you also know, cows eat grass and vegetables. And as you also know, something comes out the back end of a cow. And so the streets are, in Western terms, not that hygienic. The water, people are even afraid to take a shower in it. And so when I travel, I stay in what they call backpackers hostels. And this was the backpackers Villa Mumbai. When you look at some of these rather rundown buildings, the one in the middle was my hostel, $13 a night, but you were secure. They had a guard at the door. They had fresh water. The showers were clean. This is the kind of bunk bed area I stay in. And it was very nice because it had a magnificent roof deck. And you met absolutely phenomenal travelers. I was surprised when I was in Bombay because for the first time you saw the growth of the African and Chinese middle class, where young college kids would decide to take off and see the world, put on a backpack, and just like Westerners have been doing for a very long time, the people from Africa and China are now joining the European and the American backpackers gang. So in Goa, in Pune, and then in Mumbai, I always stayed at these hostels. Just an advice, always take a lock and a key, because every one of these rooms has a locker for every person. And so your things are secure. Well, in a city of 21 million people, you want to be safe. So I don't walk around with my passport. In fact, I always, until today, carry a photocopy of my passport, a photocopy of my New York ID, because you never know what is going to happen. But look at some of these street scenes. I mean, getting on a train to go to visit another part of Mumbai is in itself an adventure. Well, the pictures I showed you were of the heart, the old city, the Portuguese city, and then later the British city with its magnificently well-preserved buildings. But the Indians are moving into the future, like China and like so many other countries. India is building massive new neighborhoods to the north of the old city. And this is where we can see some of the magnificent new architecture, which is taking shape in the outer regions of the old peninsula. This is called cybertecture architecture. And this is called the Egg, an office building in Mumbai. And Asia has taken to phenomenally modern, crazy architecture with a passion. This is the James Law Cybertecture International out of Hong Kong. This is the type of building you'd expect to see in India, but you're seeing more and more of these phenomenal architectural office buildings, temples, churches, government buildings, which are growing up in the outskirts of the city of Mumbai. The Namaste Tower, these are the imperial towers built in the suburbs. I mean, this makes the New York World Trade Center pale in comparison to the absolutely phenomenal architecture. An entire program could be done on modern Indian architecture. I mean, every building is more exotic than the other. So that brings us to an end of this whirlwind tour Bombay, a little bit of history, a little bit of its significance, why it is the gateway to empire. And as usual, you ponder the role of empire, whether it's the United States declining empire, the rising Chinese empire. When I travel, you pick a theme and you really meditate on it. That's why I wrote my book, How New York Became the Empire City. What goes into creating a city that prides itself on being called the Empire City. And of course, Mumbai, like every other city in this series, which I'm doing now at Fort Washington, it has its own unique character.